Until we get a spell that actually helps the deck start its plays, Mad Love is stuck in tier 2. The one thing Pluton has going for it is that you can summon it during your opponent's turn 1. If anything, they better print a good card with the same summoning condition. There is fun in finding cards with unique synergies with the archetype, but sadly, you're not gonna find them. The NXE's Vanquish Soul could detach a specific attribute to activate an effect. But until this deck gets an update, we're not making it to EVO with this one, boys. It just takes one good patch to this deck, and it's playable. Apparently having the Gift of Prophecy is considered aging like milk. Most of what I mentioned in my original video came to fruition in some way, so a follow-up seemed in order. Although, this is a video that I've scrapped multiple times over. Because of how they've treated the deck in every format, I've been too demoralized to even bother making this video. But every time, when I eventually pick up the deck again, I'm reminded why I care so much about it. So unless Konami finds another way to twist the knife in my back, this video should exist now. So let's start talking about how the deck's changed. This is what the old tier list looked like. This is what it looks like now. To dissect how we got here, let's start with the first line of Duad patch notes in Start. The archetype got a field spell, and of course, it lets you search a Vanquish Soul, requiring you control one, target it, then add a versus with a different attribute. It can be a little annoying that you can't get any name off of any monster, and requires you to commit a body, but it's far from being bad. Because you can search it with Mad Love, you likely will have a body on field for it most of the time when you use it, seeing as you want to be adding fire or earth. Which, speaking of, now that Start exists, Mad Love is a phenomenal starter for the deck, which was a major problem for the deck since there was only one starter. If you open Start, Pantera's free summon can easily get you Rosin without using your normal, giving the deck more ways to be consistent in general. Just a shame that a 2-card combo you actively don't want to see isn't exactly a good reason to play her. Start also has a protection effect for your versus monsters by revealing a card in hand. This has another ramification, and that Xiaolong's summon condition is procced by it. Xiaolong can be summoned if a reveal occurs from a Vanquish Soul card's effect, not exclusively a monster's. This is worth mentioning because Stake isn't a card that can trigger him, and Snow Devil is typically a card you're activating while he's on the field, leaving it to be something you could subconsciously forget since it rarely comes up. While Start's window isn't exactly a flexible way to get Xiao out, it's still something to pay mind to. Start has one last effect, and it's probably the most underappreciated part of it. It allows you to set any Vanquish Soul trap from deck at the end phase if you have 2 or more Vanquish Souls. Obviously, the first card that comes to mind is Snow Devil, since it was basically the deck's win condition, and since it sets it from deck, it gets around Droll. This means Mad Love functionally searches 2 cards by getting Start. While Snow Devil becomes better because of this, the archetype has 2 other traps, and I feel at least one of them's been overlooked. Start breathes new life into Trinity Burst, and Calamity Caesar to a lesser extent. Playing them as one-ofs means you can set them off Start, or be fine drawing them, since Start can set another trap. Calamity Caesar's probably still not worth it though. It's targeting protection, and Start provides protection in general, making it pretty redundant. But it can protect Start considering how much of a target it is. The only real selling point for Calamity is the burn damage, actually. Between Borger and Snow Devil, it's entirely possible to close out games with burn. Sadly, I think this is just a fun-of that occasionally does what you want. Trinity Burst, on the other hand, genuinely should be reevaluated. One of the issues with the card before was its conditions in the deck's context. You special up to 2 different named monsters from hand that have a different attribute to a versus you target on field. With Start, you now have Mad Love easily facilitating this. The other issue with it is the fact that it negates the cards it summons, making it so you can't really capitalize on the monsters being summoned out. But the fact of the matter is, this is a card that lets you bounce cards. It's non-destruction removal. Now that we have so many more names worth playing in the list, with the different attributes, and way more consistency, you could genuinely play Trinity Burst and bounce your opponent's monsters. The reason why I think the card's worth reevaluating is because of the nuance in Trinity bouncing instead of popping like Snow Devil, as well as not blowing up your non-versus monsters. While the difference may not be super relevant currently, the fact it can be, and is easily accessible through Start, this card should be put on people's radar. It's definitely a worthwhile card to consider in the side deck if nothing else. Unfortunately, the support doesn't really add any new perspective to the spells. Mad Love is always going to search start, and none of the new cards necessarily make the old cards better. The biggest issue with spell traps in the archetype is that they aren't reveals, and while the deck is much better at getting card value, the deck can still risk potentially breaking on too many spell traps, making it risky to play so many. Continue gets better in the sense that it can get a new powerful monster back, and Dust Devil gets better because of said powerful monster, making it more likely to be a Book of Eclipse instead of a Book of Moon. Considering how overwhelming some boards can be to deal with, it's a card the deck certainly would appreciate more. The problem is you'll want to search start 9 times out of 10, only feeling worth it in a scenario where you drew start, or can use Zhao to search it. Like Trinity Burst, it's definitely side deck material, more so than it, but unless the deck gets more utility out of playing spells in general, it's a bit iffy to play regularly. The underlying problem is that Start is the only searchable spell the deck wants to play. Usually you can play 3 of multiple different spells even if you can only use them once per turn. This is because you aren't likely to see both, but want access to both ideally, all while not being dependent on seeing both in order to play. It just makes it so you're more likely to find something that you're missing, making it so your searcher still does something regardless of what you draw far more often than not. There's always a benefit and never really a detriment. Sadly, you don't want to play 3 start because you can only really use 1. Multiples being non-usable is doubly punishing in Vanquish because you want your slack cards in hand to be attributes that you can reveal, so most people only play 1 copy, maybe 2 if they feel the need for a spare in grind games, or are just that desperate to see it. Stake not being searchable still bites the deck in the ass because it'd be the perfect secondary search target to relieve this issue. This leads to a crossroad of conundrums. The scenario where drawing Start makes Mad Love a dead card, because Start also grabs a trap and you're only playing 1. Of course, this does mean you can bait an Ash, Imperm, etc., since negating your normal is still pretty impactful, but I imagine most players worth their salt won't do so frivolously. Then there's the scenario where Mad Love gets negated, and you didn't draw Start because you're only playing 1. Despite fixing the deck, you can't reasonably justify playing more copies because scenario 1 becomes more common. So the deck needs another good archetypal spell for her to search, one the deck can actually afford to play at 3. That way this dilemma no longer plagues the deck. The next big part of this patch is Holisu. I quite literally said, if they had a card with a similar summoning condition to Pluton, and it actually did something, the deck would benefit greatly from it. And what do you know? The best card of all time exists now. She can summon herself from hand by revealing another Vanquish Soul in your hand. This can be done on either player's turn as a quick effect, making her fall under the illustrious moniker of a turn 0 card. Her summon clause also triggers Xiaolong if he's in your hand. Since she's far more flexible than any other card in the archetype, she's always able to get Xiao off. I just realized how that sounds. By revealing a Fire and Dark, she can e-telly any name from deck, which is fitting because she's a psychic. But more importantly, she actually gives the deck something to do going second other than hand trap and pray, something that actively went against the archetype's playstyle. Since Fire and Dark are your 2 most common attributes, this effect is going to be live more often than not. Pluton could summon on your opponent's turn, but he had no real effects. You could summon him out to tag Caesar or Borger in, but those 2 aren't really going to do anything to interrupt your opponent or start your plays. Caesar could be a pop, but the odds you open Pluton, Caesar, along with 2 more specific attributes, is beyond unlikely. Pluton could also get Xiaolong on field, but if you're emptying Xiao and Pluton out of your hand, you're not using Xiao's search, so you're not doing anything productive. With Sue, you can just summon her, reveal to summon Rosin, and unlock everything Pluton's hypothetical best scenario could, and more. Potentially popping a card off Rosin's effect, then summoning Caesar searched off Rosin to pop another card. I would say making Pluton obsolete, but that would imply he was ever usable. The fact Sue summons from deck also helps resolve the other issues with the archetype. Between Rosin and Zhao, searching was common and relied upon. With her now able to play around cards that punish searching, the deck has less vulnerability in general. Sue is the first Vanquish Soul to have both their effects require 2 reveals. By revealing Earth and Dark, you can take your opponent's monster with the weakest attack stat, making it possible to just steal your opponent's monster to potentially stymie their plays, or swipe a monster that you can get use out of. It's not as great as the summon effect, but it is probably one of the best secondary effects in the archetype. there are plenty of times where just using this effect changes the game. On a more subtle level, Sue resolved another issue with the deck. Earth was the lowest value attribute in the archetype, which in turn made it hard to facilitate Caesar and Snow Devil, since you would only play Caesar for Earth's an archetype. However, Sue didn't fix everything. Earth is still the worst attribute. Attempting to play versus with other Earth archetypes was bad, because if you had Stake in a hand clogged with Earths, you'd get nothing out of it. Pantera isn't a starter, and neither is Caesar. Sue is dependent on 2 reveals, so Earth-clogged hands are still a death sentence. And while you should be able to avoid this in deck building, we'll get to why you actually won't be able to do that. Regardless, she's the best card in the archetype. Sue is probably the best piece of legacy support ever printed in the game, which I'd mostly accredit to her being a turn 0 card. She resolves a lot of the deck's fundamental issues, but she most importantly is a turn 0 card that gives the deck the ability to play on the opponent's turn, making the coin flip less important so long as you draw her. Decks with turn 0 cards released with them. But as time moves on, if more archetypes receive turn 0 cards for support, she likely won't hold that title for long. However, starting the motion will forever be a noteworthy claim. The final part of this patch is Vanquish Soul Rocks. I'm sure it won't get annoying to distinguish between Rocks and Rock. Rocks is a rank 4, and he kind of sucks. While not exactly what I envisioned for a Vanquish Soul Exceed, he ends up functioning similar to it. He gains different effects based on the attribute of the materials attached to him. Very annoyingly, he can only be made with Vanquish Souls, hurting the capacity to summon him by not letting you include a rank 4 strategy to help. I'll need you anyways. The problem is that making a rank 4 isn't really worth it with Vanquish Soul monsters. They acknowledge this fact in his design, so he can be made with one versus if you battle with one that turn. But this then defeats the entire gimmick of the card, as you're not going to set up all 3 effects, let alone 2 of them. His Dark and Fire effects are continuous effects that manipulate stats. But since you can, and want to make him with one material, neither of these are desirable. So you're just going to make him with an Earth. While I appreciate the forethought to let you make him with Rock, that isn't happening because it's a Dark, and you really don't care to just make Rocks. The most important thing about Rocks is the Earth effect, allowing you to pop a card by detaching a material. Since you're only going to make him with one monster, and you want it to be Earth, he's functionally detaching the Earth for the effect, which then means he's a glorified vanilla. You see, while you don't want to spend any of your other Vanquish Souls on a card like this, as they're infinitely better themselves, Pantera isn't a good card. Her effects were too niche and not really useful. Until now. She can activate her Battle Protection effect, crash into anything and live to set up the summoning condition of Rocks, quite literally getting your Rocks off. And since she's an Earth, Rocks has its best effect. I really appreciate them designing a card that actually attempts to recontextualize and validate one of their worst cards, but they didn't try hard enough. Hypothetically, her effect to special for free should have been a selling point, being able to make Rocks with no major commitments, but there's no reason to do that. Sue is now your most important Earth and can fulfill that role in a pinch, which is really the only time you'll be using him. I honestly forget Rocks exists most of the time because he's just so low impact for how you have to make him. All Pantera has to rely on is being a one-of piece of back row removal you can side deck, but even then, she's pretty vulnerable to being disrupted. What really sets Rocks back is that he's the only idiot in the archetype that's not a quick effect. Even Pluton is a quick effect. Non-targeting destruction is great, but you already have a card that does that. One who is one of the other 2 possible materials for this effect. Caesar is a quick effect, so you're better off keeping him on the field to use it again as interruption. Rocks has the benefit of not being once per turn, but since he's the last card from the support, and there's 0 existing infrastructure around loading materials under an XE, he's extremely lackluster. He has niche applications that come up just as fringe removal. He can be a way to economically make SP with an extra deck monster, but Rock could have been if they hadn't printed the restriction on it. He doesn't really stand out as an exceptional card. If this wave of support was just him in start, people would relentlessly mock this card before forgetting it exists entirely. But because start fixes the deck, and Sue carries it to new heights, he just kind of exists and no one really cares. He's a one-of that's playable logically, but isn't really that compelling to be playing. This entire wave of support was kind of a letdown in the art department. Starred as a homage to Street Fighter's world map select screen, but does so in such a boring way. It just uses the existing card arts and doesn't look all too interesting or striking. I would have preferred a collection of cut-ins for all the characters starting their journey, all coming together to look like a character select screen, but it's not that big a deal. But then Rox and Sue's designs felt very out of place for the archetype. For Sue, her design feels pretty underwhelming for the Vanquish Soul aesthetic. She has the evil skeletal staff, but that's it. She's a fighting game character. Where are the 50 belt straps with Bibles? Where's the giant fuck-ass cross that's also a gun? Then there's Rox. The whole reason that I've been on this sudden tangent. When I first saw Rox, I was put off by his design. His aesthetic reminded me more of Zodiac. Something I initially didn't like because it seemed drastically out of place. But there's a very likely reason he looks like a Zodiac specifically. That being foreshadowing future design. It even comes through in his effect text. You can turn one Vanquish Soul into an Xyz, just like Zodiac. And there's one very important and inconspicuous line of text on him. The weasel directly mentions transferring materials if you make him with an Xyz, despite being the only possible card that could be made with his effect. You can't make him with another copy of himself the turn you use this effect, and I don't think Konami expects you to wait a turn cycle to slap another on top of him, or God forbid use Jean K Magician to turn him into a level to hard make a second. I believe Rox is a card released early. Considering they were late to give us the card that the deck should have released with, Rox seems to have been released early to tease the future, seeing as his design becomes far more logical under the context more Vanquish Soul Xyzs with his summon clause exist, allowing you to use Xyzs as another form of tagging in the deck, climbing up multiple Xyzs to fire their detach effects before tagging into the next, with the capacity to hold materials for access to the other effects of the Xyzs that currently don't exist. I assume because of Vanquish Soul's design, they're not going to all be rank 4s. The deck can make rank 5s now. So to match how Rox can be traditionally made, a rank 5 following at some point makes sense. If they go up once more to have all attributes, we need a new level 6 for the archetype, since there's only one. If the decision to make Rox reminiscent of Zodiac was deliberate for him being a rank 4 with that effect, it's possible a rank 5 and 6 also reference archetypes with those ranks. And for 5, well, with the release of Justice Hunters, we received K9, an archetype of Darks and Earths that can punish hand and grave effects. What's most important is the fact they have Izuna, a turn 0 card that allows you to Xyz summon on your opponent's turn by way of Lupus. K9 has been splashed with other archetypes, namely Crystron, but it turns out that a deck that could literally be dubbed Dog Water proved to be the lesser choice of the two. Both hybrids can suffer from drawing the wrong half of the deck. But in the case of Vanquish Soul, the right half of the deck is always useful. It comes down more so to which specific cards you can draw in sequence. When both Sue and Izuna are powerful cards that provide you interaction even if you go second, the odds of you pushing your opponent turn 1 drastically increases, giving Vanquish Soul K9 a unique edge. While Vanquish Soul was capable of topping without the K9 cards, they still had clear weaknesses, many of which I already brought up. The reality is that receiving only one main deck name didn't fill out the deck count. Pantera and Pluton still aren't legitimately playable, so their slots in the list are still vacant, and nothing was really added numerically, leaving a sizable gap in their lists. So you still needed high impact cards with attributes like hand traps to fill out the list, leaving the deck to still feel bricky, just less so than before. Archmage is an archetype that had some elements of design that would have worked really nicely alongside Vanquish Soul, namely their focus on different monster types and benefiting from them, but they were all lights and wouldn't help the deck. One of the biggest issues Vanquish Soul had outside of its own design was that seemingly no archetype was designed to synergize with them meaningfully, so there really wasn't a good way to fill that gap. There were instances of overlap, but it was impossible to find a perfect symbiotic relationship between the two. Considering K9 released not too long after the Vanquish Soul support, I absolutely believe K9 was intended to synergize with Vanquish Soul to an extent. They cover two attributes of Vanquish Soul and have versatility in hand, with plenty ability to load more attributes into your hand. Since Sue and Zhao are 5s, Vanquish Soul itself can make rank 5s alongside the K9 cards. The only issue that persists is Vanquish Soul is actually a well-designed archetype, as turning your names into generic extra deck monsters is typically a disservice to the deck, which is part of why Rocks isn't all that impressive of a card. However, with K9, there's actually a case, as you can very well reasonably play more copies of Xiaolong. With Sue, she gives you 2 5s for free if Xiaolong's in hand. She can even give you 3 5s by summoning another Xiaolong from deck, but that's getting lost in the weeds of things. The important part is that she can always get you to a rank 5. Because of her, you can get all the card advantage you need to feel comfortable overlaying them, since they then bridge into the K9 half of the deck with Ripper. The real issue with this synergy is that Pantera isn't playable. How are they supposed to kiss if they're not both in the deck? Other than the deck having access to 2 turn 0 cards, there were other elements of their design that came together nicely. Both Jokel and Lantern are searchers, making it so you can grab a Dark or Earth through both of them, with Case, the archetypal searcher, letting you get another attribute. This meant while you were now committing more bodies on board, you were still plenty capable of sustaining reveals, which is usually the biggest issue with other archetypes. And of course, Izuna could be an Earth reveal in hand that lets you make a rank 5 with Lupus on your opponent's turn. The only real point of concern with K9 versus is that they're mostly Earths. Izuna is an instant 3-of, with Lupus being a mandatory 1-of. Noroi is yet another Earth added into the mix, making for a majority of Earths. Jokel and Lantern are the Darks, but Lantern is the least flexible name, making him a liability at multiple copies. So you only really have Jokel to pad out your Darks, leaving you with far more Earths in deck, the attribute you care about least. Add to the fact you're also playing a Garnet that's not even an attribute. You also start to realize that Zhao is best used as rank 5 material. Very often I never get to use Zhao's effect anymore, because it's unlikely to have 2 fires in hand with this hybrid. So Zhao becomes a less impactful card beyond being a material to make Ripper or another rank 5. While Vanquish Soul can bridge into K9, they can't really return the favor. They sort of can by way of Hail Marying a Saryuja to draw into them, but it clearly feels like Vanquish Soul is doing more in the relationship. And the K9 portion feels underwhelming in gameplay, as it served more as a generic rank 5 control strategy. Ripper hits a hand trap or a grave effect, and that's the extent of their gameplay. People even cut their tag out spell since it was a bricky card that felt win more most of the time. Although, K9 highlighted an element of deck building people somewhat neglected. Spells can in fact be monsters. Surge spells can be any attribute you need. The problem was there weren't any good search spells that accomplished this efficiently. Since K9 consists of 2 attributes, their search spell is also an attribute search functionally. So between it and start, you can search out 2 attributes. I tried to play Vanquish Soul with Tri-Brigade because Tenki getting Fractal translates to searching any attribute, but the annoying thing, other than not being particularly synergistic, was that their design would inherently have you lose cards when you're actively trying to hold on to them in Vanquish Soul. K9 provided the first archetype to actually give you that flexibility in searching while not being a complete liability. The big concern with search spells is that you run hard into Droll, which was already a problem. But it cannot be understated how valuable it is when you're granted the flexibility that Versus wants. Of course, K9 couldn't give you access to fire, which is the most important attribute. As good as this patch was for the deck, it would also subsequently introduce a new problem for the deck. It became clear I evidently wished on a monkey's paw. I wished for an archetype that actually synergized with Vanquish Soul. Now you literally cannot play the deck without that archetype. They would put both Rosin and Stake to 1, making the deck unplayable pure. The crux of the problem with Vanquish Soul was that you couldn't play more of it. Sue and Start helped to amend that, but the decision to hit Rosin and Stake set the deck back to square one. Its power ceiling is high, but its consistency was back in the dumps, which was the biggest problem with the deck, because you would just brick on hands that don't get the ball rolling. K9 Vanquish Soul would continue to top events in spite of this list, both because K9's general power level was still high and left mostly unchecked, with the capacity to still occasionally play Vanquish Soul, but also because Draco Tail became the deck to beat, and K9 Vanquish Soul had a knack for dumpstering Draco Tail, leaving it to still be positioned as an exceptional deck for the format. The next ban list, they decided to undo these hits, and instead put Su to 1. Rosin to 1 not only hurt consistency with less copies, it also hurt Xiaolong because you had even less fires. With Su at 1 instead, the deck rarely has turn 0 play natively, and less Earths, which was a problem, and now it's a problem again. Unless, of course, you're playing K9 to fill out the Earth slots, leaving the deck in a scenario where it's being punished because of K9 and forcing you to play it with K9 if you want to play it at all. They did actually directly hit K9, but not in the way that you'd want for meaningful change. Jokul and Case being at 1 makes it so the Earth disparity is even worse now. While Chaotic Elements sort of mitigates the Case limit, you still do have less Darks in deck, and that does matter. While K9 Vanquish Soul remained a top deck earning multiple tops regardless of the change, it clearly wasn't going to last. And even then, the gameplay of the deck is notably less fun. Both because the less frequent Vanquish Soul gameplay, as well as the more frequent bricking. If you ask anybody that actually liked the deck, they would tell you the Vanquish Soul cards were the satisfying and fun part of playing the deck. And that's the part of the deck that was most restricted. Because instead of opting to remove every card that introduced problematic gameplay generically, Vanquish Soul was still being hit. The literal part of the deck that produced engaging gameplay. They won't hit Ripper because it's the face of K9, and they won't hit other problematic cards because God knows why at this point. We're left in a scenario where Vanquish Soul is dead in spirit, being puppeted by K9 to occasionally see play. I originally planned to make this video way back in September of last year, when it would have been relevant to have made. The blatant disrespect for the archetype made me demotivated. Why bother talking about how great the deck is now when it's dead? Why bother highlighting its positive design to further build upon when they clearly don't even give a damn about the positive design? Then I remembered, I manifested the good parts of Yummy and Cool Tune in the state of Synchros. And considering I manifested this support, I'm just gonna manifest more. So let's talk about what that could look like. Holly Sue implies we could receive an attribute for every level the deck already has. The deck has a level 4 for every attribute, but every other level only had one name. So this means we're missing a level 5 Dark, level 6 Dark and Earth, level 7 Fire and Earth, and Fire and Dark level 8s. But other than just being open slots in the roster, there are certain design elements behind the given levels. Between Su, Zhao, and Pluton, level 5 and 6s are conditional free summons, and the level 7 and 8s are tag-ins, whereas the 4s are normal summons with removal effects. Despite being the deck's normal summons, they aren't all starters. Madlove and Rosin are, but not Pantera. She could have searched Stake to have maintained that theme and actually be worth playing, but I guess the special summon clause would have made that too good, and they didn't want to cut that special summon clause for some reason. Other than the levels, there's another indicator of future support direction. Every single monster is a different type, so all support is going to differ in type from what we already have, meaning there are 14 types still open. Actually expanding on a massive roster like this also opens deck building to become a matter of choosing your fighter, as you'll likely not be able to play all of them in one list for a hyper-effective strategy, which would be nice for the archetype to have a variety of ways to be built natively, while potentially encouraging playing them with different archetypes based on the fighters you build with. The first order of business is expanding on the extra deck. Make good on Rox's design premise. Obviously, give them a rank 5 based on K9. I would say then K9 can finally return the favor, but they already decided you can only make Rox with versus names only. They established the design theme of 1 a removal effect plus 2 continuous effects, so expand on that. Give it another useful removal effect that's live if it has a dark material. Since you can use Rox to pop a card, then use this card's effect, giving you a literal offensive combo between them that you only drop once you fire all the XC monster effects. It'd certainly help if they also had continuous effects that actually mattered. This is just a basic template for what I'd hope for out of a newer Vanquish Soul XC. Making all of your verses unaffected would be annoying and honestly redundant, considering Start and Snow Devil. But I think making this protection only apply to the Xyz is fine, because at least in that case, it incentivizes you making it with another attribute to then protect making Xyz with other cards, which is one of the clear weaknesses of them not being quick effects. The idea of making your opponent reveal cards to use their effects is a neat gimmick. It doesn't outright screw over play like Iceberry or Fuckhead, and while it does give you hand knowledge, it's in such a controlled way that it's not really that toxic. seeing as they can reveal one pretty obvious inconsequential card for every effect. It just silently forces the opponent to play similarly and maintain cards in hand, but only needing them to hold on to one card doesn't choke them out. But what if you hand rip them? Better question, what if we stopped allowing hand rips to exist in the game? They decided to make Pumpkin a rank 6 deck, and it's zombie related, perfectly matching Pluton, the deck's existing level 6. So I think that's a good groundwork for a rank 6 Vanquish Soul. I figure a Gabonga-like effect would be a good thing to introduce with the Xyz focus of the archetype. Especially in the case of Vanquish Soul Xyz, since it has the potential to slide an attribute onto your Xyz to get another effect online. It'd be interesting to actually have a dichotomy between the continuous effects on the monster as well, having one that punishes playing in its column, like Rosin and Pantera, and another effect that sort of forces your opponent to play something into its column. Another design principle I want to highlight is effects that trigger when Vanquish Soul monsters leave the field in general, both because of the tagging out as well as linking off for rock. This part of their design could be used as a way to provide more disruption. If they further build on how you interact with the Vanquish Soul Xyz, I hope they expand on the gameplay relation with the materials, recycling them back to hand in a similar vein to Materiactor, or sliding them out from under an Xyz in a similar fashion to Kashtira Big Bang. As the deck's monsters actually do things, being able to pivot them out from under the Xyz would be useful, while sort of adding another form of tagging to the archetype's design, especially considering Rocks itself isn't a quick effect, so being able to tag out of them for the quick effects gives the deck more flexibility. Naturally, another thing they could stand to do is actually print a Vanquish Soul that enables Xyz summoning. If they really want to, it could just be designed to let you make any of the ranks, pulling a versus from deck alongside it, then copying its level. Cards literally designed to be material for Xyz are extremely boring in design, but are essential. I can't really think of a mechanically interesting way to get two bodies on board for an Xyz with little to no effort. So I think having effects that apply to the Xyz, depending on its attribute, is a great way to make such a card unique, as it'll vary depending on what Xyz it's underneath, as well as provide an inverse of the Xyz design itself. That way you can tag into another Xyz, and the effect it gives changes. If you're especially inspired, the bestowed effects could be quick effects, giving them an actual presence as endboard pieces. But while you can bolster the extra deck strength, there's still other issues within the main deck that need to be addressed. Primarily, ways to actually make the rejects of the archetype worth playing. That way the roster is much easier to fill out, but attempting to truly salvage Pantera and Pluton seems nearly impossible. The best possible thing to make them worth playing would be a card that straight up glues them both to your hand permanently, never letting you lose card value with them no matter how you use them, making it so you always have 2 of the 3 attributes on hand. But doing this just to force you to play them as one-ofs is never going to feel good mechanically, and it's not going to resolve the deck's current lacking body count. There really isn't a good way to make Pluton playable especially. Everything about his design just makes him unusable. Horrible effects, and a hyper-specific summoning window. There is one fringe use for him, in that you can make him the largest monster on field, so you can turn him into Typhon, but because his summon condition is so bad, and Typhon isn't that great, this one niche is just pathetic. And attempting to model an in-archetype version of this won't make it any less pitiful. The one technical way to make Pluton playable is with far more tag-out names in deck, so it's actually common to just put him on board and turn him into a monster that actually does something. But even then, he's not really doing anything. So you would quite literally need link ones that require the reject specifically and function more like apology retrains to actually make them appealing. Pantera could become a cornerstone 3-of in the deck if she had a link one that searched stake. Look, at this point, I'd take this effect on an Xyz you can only realistically summon after the battle phase. But if you want to fix Pantera, this is the only way to do it. She's a free summon. If she gets you stake without committing your normal, she legitimately becomes the best card in the entire deck. Amend her to actually search the card she's on, and we're right as rain. Pluton, on the other hand, I still find it difficult for a Link 1 to salvage him. The summon window is still a major setback, since you'll have to summon him by other means, which in turn means it would have to do something disproportionately powerful to justify summoning him instead of literally anyone else. A fun effect that could be potentially game-winning is utilizing the stat manipulation on a broader scale, making all your opponent's monsters have 0 attack, or all of your Vanquish Souls 3000 attack. But fun doesn't really take precedence in this case. They could give these Link 1's Rock's recursive effect, but then have it activate an effect based on the attribute of the card it adds back to hand. This would also be unique mechanical lore, as Rock doesn't have an additional effect because he's sealed away. You have the Pantera link Search Stake if you add an Earth, then give it some good utility effects for other attributes. That way it has flexibility. Give the Pluton link the ability to cut your opponent's monsters down to 0 if it adds a Fire, boost your guys to 3k if you add a Dark, then something else useful if you add an Earth. That way he isn't just useful for niche game closeouts. This makes it so these cards have much better utility in the deck overall. It's just sad that this is probably the only meaningful way they could make them genuinely worth running, because this isn't likely. They could take a similar design approach they did with the Xyz for the archetypal links, establishing a clause to make higher link ratings easier to summon out, similar to how the new Atlantis cards work. This could very well be used to make use of a part of the deck's design that's less impactful currently, that being innate benefits from revealing cards. A clause that reduces the link rating by 1 for each revealed attribute makes their effects impactful at all times. In a way, making reveals also function like building meter for your super. The only issue is figuring out how the hell you'd translate that to game mechanics. It'd have to be something like, based on cards you've revealed in a turn with a given card. If they want to limit how flexibly they can be used, they can either design them to have their best effects relating to a given attribute, or make them require a Vanquish Soul of a given attribute as material, making it so only certain names can make specific links into easier summons. And if you're scared of link slop, but still want the deck to be able to link climb into other versus links, you can quite literally just make their arrows bad. Crazy to think you can actually utilize the mechanic's own design elements to balance it. There are quite a few times where your monster will be negated, or not really have an impactful use of their effect, but you can still reveal for cost, regardless if it's negated or low impact. Currently, this only sees relevance in getting Xiaolong out of hand. Links like this give more use to your lower impact Vanquish Souls, as simply revealing can get your plays moving along in a pinch. It means Pantera summoning for free to fire off her effects makes her a great starter, which she should have been. In my original video, I came up with an idea for how Vanquish Soul could use extra deck mechanics in a unique way, having cards that stay in hand to be reveals, but can then be summoned out on your opponent's turn to perform the summoning mechanic. They stole that idea and put it on an Automat card. They also decided Vanquish Soul Xyz wouldn't have quick effects, so that design seems pretty pointless now. Unless you design the new Xyz summon enabler I mentioned to function like this, which, given the existence of Azuna, would probably cause annoyance more than anything else, since she was sort of that already in spirit. But it could be utilized solely for synchro summoning design in the context of the archetype, assuming that's even on the table. They gave the deck one Link and one Xyz. There's nothing saying they won't give the deck a synchro in the future. I just hope if they do make them, it's not a case like Rocks, where the card is mid unless more exist, then more don't exist. Vanquish Soul synchros could have effects on summon to set them apart from the Xyz. Then the standard attribute related effects, requiring you put an attribute engraved back to hand for a specific effect. Alternatively, they could just cap the extra deck off at fusions with an archetypal mask change, since it's more in line with the tag-out style of design in the deck, with the archetypal difference being it bounces the card instead of sending it to grave, making the fusions level 7 and 8 if the Xyz are 4, 5, and 6. A quick play mask change style card also gives the deck tagouts possible in the battle phase, something the main deck 7s and 8s can't do. The downside for these is that they're spells, so you can't use them as reveals. But if they're designed with good different effects based on the attribute it balanced, it can very easily be a way to mitigate drawing them as a major downside, which is a struggle with any spell trap for the archetype. In terms of monster effect design in general, there's a little more to expand on. Start designing more of the choice effects as going first and going second effects, since it's the best way to make both effects highly applicable regardless of game state. Sue is currently the best one to an extent with her brain control effect, but I'd like to see some more deliberate design around it, making sure that the effects have more utility that encourages you to think about which you value more at a given moment. In regards to designing new monsters in general for the main deck, I came to realize how well spirits fit Vanquish Soul unironically. Design them to be free bodies if you control a Vanquish Soul, then they return to hand at the end phase to maintain attribute value in hand. Have them be additional normal summons that target a Vanquish Soul on field to summon out, then gain an effect based on the target's attribute. They could represent transformations or hyperforms that only last temporarily. Other than this basic design synergy, there's another element of design to tap into to further warrant this, making them spirit pendulums. Currently, there are only a few that exist. funnily enough, even having column effects. The core idea behind them, though, is that they bounce back to hand from scale. While they specifically do so in relation to them pendulum summoning, since they're the only ones currently, there's nothing saying that this is the concrete function of spirit pendulums. So Vanquish Soul ones could be designed to bounce at end phase like the standard monster effect. This design avenue gels with Vanquish Soul's design perfectly. It can be used to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, designing the monster effects to be useful into an established board, then the pendulum effects that are more relevant in application going first, with them always returning to hand regardless to help the deck maintain reveals. One of the biggest issues with spells and traps in the context of the deck is that they can't be reveals, so Pendulum can just be used as a means of having spells that can be reveals. Rather than introducing a convoluted measure of treating spells and traps as attributes, this can perfectly mend that issue. The only problem is that Mad Love can't search them to resolve her problem, so you have to avoid letting this entirely invalidate her. Maybe just make a spell that validates it with her, a sort of Draco face-off for Vanquish Soul, letting you scale 1 from deck, then add another to hand. Something like reveal a Vanquish Soul in hand, then get 2 pendulums with different attributes from the revealed card. This allows you to get a name, use a spell effect, then add it to hand at end phase as a reveal. The fact that it would be limited to pendulum names is a way to inherently limit the general power level, so long as they don't make the pendulums have absurdly broken effects. I already know, Konami. Just print the text, "You can only pendulum summon Vanquish Soul monsters on these hypothetical pendulums." Even though you shouldn't even be designing them with the intent to pendulum summon anyways, given the deck's playstyle. I thought the idea of making them all scale 5, then have the ability to reduce or increase it by 4 based on reveals would be neat, but ultimately not really important to design. Introducing pendulum summoning isn't really useful. It's just that this specific card type can be utilized to perfectly resolve a lot of the archetype's issues in a way other cards can't. One of the main concerns for introducing pendulums is what happens if they get sent to the face-up extra. Since we don't want to bother with pendulum summoning, there needs to be some sort of innate way to recur them. Well, there's actually already a good way to do so, designing them with the same tag-out philosophy while in the extra deck, bouncing a name on board to summon out from the extra deck. If they don't want you to be able to load the extra, then cycle every single penned name, it can quite literally just be designed to bounce non-pendulums exclusively, limiting how many you can use of these at a time, since they'll still have to adhere to the EMZ and link arrows, while ensuring they're not completely dead cards once they end up in the extra. Alternatively, if they expand on the role of the XCs in the deck, they could be designed to work with them instead, attaching from the extra deck to an XC. That way they go to grave and can be recovered by cards like Continue and Rock, as well as enable a way to slide attributes underneath the XCs to actually get their additional effects. The last matter of business for their design would be in figuring out how to resolve their issues with spell traps in general. Because you want to be playing them at a minimum, it would help if there were not only a way to trade them in for a reveal, but also recycle them. That way they still serve a role in gameplay, while also avoiding causing hiccups in play. Since most of their spells are quick plays, there's an innate balance to resetting them if you trade them in. It's also possible they find design avenues that lean into them being quick plays. One of the most satisfying things in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is dodging mechanically, sending cards that are face up on field to facilitate other effects. Things like activating a card, then using droplets to send that card for value and potentially avoid it getting negated. A quick effect 1-for-1 bounce could be a neat way to capitalize on this. That way you can use Continue or Dust Devil, then bounce it back to hand while bouncing an opponent's card. It also lets you get more mileage out of Trinity Burst, since you can put bodies on board with it to bounce, then bounce one of those negated bodies back to hand early for another bounce. Or you could just bounce Trinity Burst to get more bounces at once. But of course, this would have to be on a new monster you commit to the board. We can make them satisfying to play, but we still have to make them worth drawing. So there's still the issue of finding a perfect design for spells in this deck. I think the only thing you could legitimately get it to work is a spell that reveals a card type and adds a Vanquish Soul card with a different card type. Then you draw a card in addition if you reveal the spell or trap, replacing itself and making it so the other spell trap isn't holding you back from a reveal, giving you a benefit if spell traps end up in your hand, even another copy of the card itself, with it also providing some flexibility to search spell traps if you needed to. Another simple, worthwhile spell could be one that adds a Vanquish Soul from grave back to hand, then adds a Vanquish Soul with a different attribute from deck. This way you can make rock with any Vanquish Soul and still get use out of it, allowing you to use the effect to special summon the Vanquish Soul you searched to push plays off a potentially bricked hand. Lastly, the deck could use a new trap card. It's not really necessary, I just think designing one more would be a good way to further capitalize on Start's trap setting effect. Making it a continuous trap would set it apart from all the others. Of course, just because Start can set it doesn't exactly make it appealing to play if it doesn't do something impactful. So it needs design that doesn't make it a bad draw. Design that lets you activate it the turn it's set. This could have the in-archetype clause that requires you reveal versus cards to do so. 2 or 3 if you really want to be strict on it, requiring a lot of engine in hand to even use it going first. Hell, with this clause, it can even unbrick a Xiaolong in hand, which is another utility in its own right. The important part is stating archetypal cards in general. That way spells and traps in archetype can still make this card work going first. I think it'd be cool if it let you tag a versus on field for one in hand, just like the normal tag outs, but allowing you to do it with any versus name in hand instead, then bouncing an opponent's card in the column you summoned to. The issue is, a card like this is best served as a starter, since drawing spell traps is always going to cause that issue for the deck. In that case, designing it to tag into a Vanquish Soul from deck makes more sense. Making it so any Vanquish Soul with this trap is exactly who you'd want, but I feel like that might be a bit extreme on face value. So the one design restriction could be that, like Start, it can only get different attributes. If it's different attributes, Pantera can be turned into a Rosin without spending your normal, adding more value and actually including her. And even if you aren't activating at turn 1, being able to summon a Vanquish Soul from deck on your opponent's turn is impactful. There's quite a lot of unique ways to expand on the deck's existing design, while also fixing their remaining issues. The deck isn't bad, it's just disjointed again. Earth needs to actually catch up to the other 2 attributes in importance, and the old cards need to have much greater value in the deck. So support should aim to fix that in every way, while still adding some more to the deck to make it feel fresh. Just so we're clear, if there's another monkey's paw, one important element of design that doesn't need to be expanded upon is the burn damage. By all means, do not add any more burn effects. Burn decks are unhealthy and suck for gameplay. Vanquish Soul is around the perfect threshold where it can use burn to clutch out and close games, but not just perform dumb FTKs. I want to stress, the deck quite literally does not and should not receive any more cards that inflict burn damage. And if you design a dumb fuck floodgate, I'm going to take every last one of your fingers. I expect that apology support on my desk by the end of the year, with an overframe of a Pantera retrain and an animation chronicles for Vanquish Soul. Or else.